Now, I have a little preacher in me, but you can see it. But I don't think I'm going to preach today. What I want to do is to put on my other hat. I want to think carefully about this question or this issue of African American identity. I think it has a particular resonance in this moment because many of us are struggling with what it means to invoke a notion of black identity in the age of Obama, whatever that phrase might mean. And so I want to think about identity from my own philosophical vantage point. I'm a pragmatist by inclination, by temperament. And so I want to think about how we may invoke a notion of blackness without falling into some of the more troublesome traps that invocation might, at least in the past, generate. So I begin with two quotations. Y'all ready? It's going to be like my Princeton lecture. So every now and then I might dip out, right, and start talking about something else. My students call it a Glaudian tangent, right? I want to begin with the first quotation from John Dewey's Ethics, published in 1932. Dewey wrote, "Every choice sustains a double relation to the self. It reveals the existing self, and it forms the future self. But every choice," Dewey writes, "is at the forking of the roads. And the path chosen shuts off certain opportunities and opens others. In committing oneself to a particular course, a person gives a lasting set to his being. Consequently, it is proper to say that in choosing this object rather than that, one is in reality choosing what kind of person or self one is going to be. One is in reality choosing what kind of person or self one is going to be." Another quotation, this one by the great James Baldwin, from his work, The Devil Finds Work. "An identity is questioned only when it is menaced, as when the mighty begin to fall, or when the wretched begin to rise, or when the stranger enters the gates, never thereafter to be a stranger." Bless you, bless you. "Identity would seem to be the garment which one covers the nakedness of the self, in which case it is best that the garment be loose, a little like the robes of the desert, through which one's nakedness can always be felt and sometimes discerned. The trust in one's nakedness is all that gives one the power to change one's robes." One of the striking consequences of the tragedy of race in the United States has been the preoccupation with identity formation among African Americans. Because most African Americans entered this fragile experiment in democracy as chattel, as somebody else's belongings, the question of who they take themselves to be has been intimately connected to a political and social reality which denied them recognition. As such, African Americans historically stand in an uneasy relation to America, constantly faced with the choice, a tragic choice at times, of accepting America as home or rejecting the possibility of ever flourishing on these shores. Ironically, in the initial phases, this struggle over the issue of identity took place in the context of a country uneasy about its own identity in relation to Europe. We need only recall Ralph Waldo Emerson's words in his 1837 address, American Scholar, right? There he urged an adolescent nation to declare intellectual independence, to shake off its inferiority complex, and to forge a form of life reflected of the nation's distinctive landscape. Emerson powerfully declared in the opening lines of that address, quote, "Our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands draws to a close. The millions that around us are rushing into life cannot always be fed on the sere remains of foreign harvests. Events, actions arise that must be sung, that will sing themselves. Who can doubt that poetry will revive and lead in a new age as the star in the constellation Harp, which now flames in our zenith, astronomers announce, shall one day be the pole star for 1,000 years," end quote. Walt Whitman took himself to answer Emerson's call, and his poetry sung of America, yes? But African Americans were forced to create themselves amid the absurdity of a nation committed at once to freedom and unfreedom. Theirs was a blue note, an unstable chord which called attention to the unbridled chaos at the heart of American democracy. That African Americans have been, for the most part, successful in these attempts at self-creation is testimony to the enormous power of their creative energies. However, questions of Black identity still remain a central concern for us today. How should African Americans identify, understand themselves as individuals and as a group in relation to a nation that historically denied them recognition? What are we to make of this past in light of the successes of the civil rights movement and the expansion of a Black middle class? After all, I stand before you in a very nice suit, I think. Right? One thing to be sure is that the ideas of Black identity continue to animate the political choices of many African Americans, generating vexing concerns about the appropriateness of such ideas in efforts to secure justice in our democracy. And all of this is all the more complicated by the fact of President Obama's presidency, that Black body that's constantly interrupting us. Of course, a lot is at stake when we begin a discussion about racial identity of any sort in the United States, right? We question how people orient themselves in a constantly changing world. We worry about how individuals see themselves in relation to their fellows and find their place in a set of stories that binds them to similarly situated selves. Do they identify with others on the basis of blood, language, customs, and/or inheritance? We are horrified by the prospects that differences that really do not make a difference serve as the basis for exclusion and a lack of moral concern for others. We worry then about identities wrongly understood, about how they blind us to the central lesson that tragedy teaches, that crude reductions of the moral complexity of our moral lives often lead to an exclusive attachment of one value and a disregard for others. We become like Creon in Sophocles' Antigone, singularly obsessed. All right? Y'all all right? Just checking in on you. Now, I'm particularly interested in the ways Black identity in the United States continue to motivate political and ethical choices that shape our world. For such identity talk entails answers to who we as African Americans take ourselves to be, and how we orient ourselves to quote unquote others, how we conceive of our obligations to those whom we consider to be one of us, and what constitutes the good for us. We can translate all of that in terms of what does it mean to keep it real? What does it mean to be authentic? How are we to understand whether or not we hang out with the Black folk at the cafeteria table? What does it mean to self-segregate? What does it mean to think of ourselves as having some necessary obligation to those who look like us? Right? In other words, whether we know it or not, how we think about Black identity affects how we understand notions of virtue, ideas of the right and the good, in the context of this particular community of experience. That is to say, when persons act in the name of these identities, they often presume that their actions and dispositions form the basis of widespread approbation, that they are obligatory and legitimate, and that there is a supreme end that defines, for the most part, their desires and purposes. How we think about Black identity matters, particularly when we hold the view that our beliefs about the world have ethical significance. It matters then if someone believes that there is an African culture that properly orients African-descended people throughout the world, or if another person believes that races are fictions, that they're not real. Both of these views wield a tremendous amount of influence in the U.S. Academy, but also in the arena of politics. So in this talk tonight, I want to critically examine a particular view of Black identity, which assumes that notions of obligation to the race and the desires and purposes of African American individuals are derivative and dependent upon a view of who we take ourselves to be, independent of the choices we make. I got to read that sentence again.